Okay, I brought you back over to the machine because as I've stitched that seam, I've realised there's a couple of little tips I could have passed on. So I'm just going to show you on this one. As you know, we're going to use the edge of the foot for the guide. And your pins, if you notice, I always put my pins in going across the seam, so into the side, horizontal to the edge, okay? So they're going in this way. That's because a couple of things. If you've got a really bad seam that really isn't wanting to behave, you can stitch over your pin if you have put it in this way. So your seam line is here and the pin is, I believe the word's perpendicular, could be wrong, but anyway, yes, your pin goes across it. So the sewing machine needle will come up to the pin. You'll go very slowly. The needle will jump either in front or behind of your pin and won't break, and you can carry on sewing, but you must do it very slowly, okay? If you catch it, it does blunt your needles quicker because obviously the tip is having to hit the metal and then move. Personally, what I do these days, I very rarely do, but sometimes you just might have something. If you were sewing very silky fabric and it was being very naughty, you might want to sew over your pins, and that's how you do it. But personally, I sew up to the foot with my pin and then I remove it. And then I will carry on. So I'm going to carry on sewing this seam, matching my edges, using my fingers gently to guide it, using the edge of the foot as my guide. And I'm coming up to the armhole. Now I'm going to take that pin out before we go over it. I will just make sure there's just the tiniest little stretch needed to just make these fabrics fall perfectly together. If you remember, we spoke about ease. Now I've taken the one out under the armhole and I'm going to go slowly towards the armhole, and when my needle comes to the edge of the seam side, the edge of the fabric, if you remember, we're using a zigzag here, so my needle is nearest this edge. I've stopped it roughly where I know the seam edge is. It doesn't have to be exact because it's under an armpit, no one's going to see, but roughly where the seams meet, and on this right hand side, and I'm going to turn my fabric slightly. So before I turn it, I've made sure my needle has gone all the way down and is coming just a little way back up, and only a little bit. It has to have turned, it has to have gone down and coming back up so it catches that thread. If you're doing corners and things and you find that you're not getting a good corner and your thread's nipping across it, it's because your needle's gone down but it hasn't started on its upward journey, and so it cannot make the stitch, so it will miss a stitch. So the needle has gone down just under and it's on its upward journey. You can see that as you turn it, it's just on the way up. So I'm now going to lift the foot and I'm going to turn it. It's only a little bit, it's not 90 degrees on this, it's whatever it is, just so that I'm running straight along this arm instead of making it like a curve. I have put a little corner in it, and I'm going to carry on to the end of the sleeve now. Okay, again to my pin, stop, take my pin out, match up these two. This is the curly one, remember, the plain is always curlier on the edges than the printed, must be to do with what they do with it. And I'm going to gently use it and guide it along my foot. Take my bottom pin out, make sure I've got those edges matched nicely. Finger on my corner, finger slightly in, just to hold them together gently, no pressure, really gently, run it through, and that's my seam done. I'm going to cut off my thread. I'm back here to cut this thread off as well. If you remember, we cut our threads off, you don't have to do it after. And here's my seam. Okay, so this is my zigzag all the way along. We've slightly turned here, okay, just to make it a little easier on the other side. When we press this over, if you're having a problem with this laying, you can snip into here. I don't think I will, but we'll see. Okay. Right, I've just pressed my seams on both sides, and I've turned it through. On little things like this, there are a number of things you can do. If you were wanting to reach perfection and you were going to do these to sell, you would actually do a bit of pressing before this. You'd probably trim your seam. The likelihood is you'd use an overlocker, but you can do it this way, but you'd trim your seam. I won't trim my seam because I'm happy for it not to be trimmed. But one of the other things you would do, it does make it a little easier. You can use a sleeve board. When your kids are getting older, if you're doing this for like a 5-year-old, I would probably use the sleeve board actually. For a 2-year-old, I wouldn't. People don't iron the way that they used to. So, but what you do is, we're going to pop this onto the sleeve board and then press the seam one way or the other. And that will help when we press the other side. The other thing about pressing, because I know a lot of people don't iron these days, so pressing they find really something they think's unnecessary. But the other thing about pressing a garment that you're making is you're sort of putting in the seams for the future people, whoever you're making this for them to carry on and get a nice finish on it. Because they won't press it, they'll just iron it. So your pressing will go forward. Right, I've just turned that through, and you'll probably see, because I have this side is the one that I've just pressed. The other seams I haven't. So in order to press this before we go any further, the seams, I'm hoping you can see here, let's move closer. You can see the seam here. And what I want to do, I want to get that as evenly down the middle as possible, not towards the front, not towards the back, as evenly down the middle as possible, so that we get a good press on it, and this is a nice flat finish at the side. Okay, so I'm making sure it's all nice and flat, and hopefully it's not too far back and it's not too far forward, and I'm going to press. There we go. So I've pressed that edge along there. It was much easier on the edge that I'd turned under. As you'll see as we move along to this sleeve, it's still very curly, but you can still do it. It's just a little harder. So I'm just going to even it along with my fingers. There we are. That's actually really nice. It's sat. I'm going to put the iron on here, just pressing it and taking it off. So I'm going to do the other side, and then we'll start the neck. We're going to fit a neckband onto the t-shirt that we've been making. I've come to the machine, and we're going to do the very magic ham hot seam to join this neckband strip. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is make sure we have the right sides of the fabric together. On the plain t-shirt, and it is very difficult to see, I prefer the slightly ribbed side. If you're not sure, choose the side and always stick with the same one. I go for the slightly ribbed side. So I'm going to put the edges of this neck strip together, as you can see, the thin edges. I'm just folding them together like so. So they're together at this edge here. I know it's a bit curly. And then what I'm going to do, you see I have the two edges here, and I'm going to bring the back two edges here to match the front two edges. Okay, so I've got a fold here, and I've got the 4 raw edges down here. This is, we would like them to be as together as possible. Just stretch that a little bit. If you have to undo it and redo it again, it's not a problem, so just undo it again. And just make sure they're together. You can use your clips and your pins here, but it's very small, so I think really just doing it with your fingers is fine. So the 2 ends together, and I'm going to again fold those ends over like that. So I have my fold here and the 4 raw edges here. I'm going to put this under my machine, and I'm going to sew this seam. I'm also going to reverse at both ends of this seam because I don't want my stitching to come undone. Now I'm leaving it on the zigzag, but I'm going to make it a little smaller. So I put it on about a 2 and a bit narrower as well. Okay, so I'm just going to run along this, and rather than reverse, I know I did say I was going to reverse at both ends, and on your modern machines it's really easy to do. It's not quite, I can reverse on this, but she doesn't like it in zigzag. So I'm going to turn it round, and I'm actually going to stitch back. Okay, and that's the equivalent of reversing it. I'm going all the way to the end. So if you don't have a reverse on your machine, this is what you would have to do just to make it work right. And I'm just going to go forward again. Okay, I'm taking that out. So remember, on your modern machines you would just reverse there at both ends. So here we are, we're all stitched up. There's my small zigzag. That's what I've chosen to use. You can use a straight stitch or whatever stitch you want with your thing, but I'm happy with the zigzag. Now what we need to do is, it's just magic, it really is. We take one layer and you fold it back like you open it back up. All right, so we're opening this up and you just tug, and there we have the seam. Okay, so it's just magic really. It's joined. Now you wouldn't use this ham-hocked seam method if you were doing anything that you want to thread elastic through, because this is now stitched down. But it's great for doing your cuffs and your necks to secure that join. Okay, so I'm going to move over to the table and I'm going to show you how you would prepare this to put on.